Welcome into Overtime, presented by McDonald's. Along with John Bruce, I'm Dewey Dailey. As we bring you into this week's episode. Week 2, John, is now behind us, and we'll look back on it and also look ahead to Week 3. A lot of good performances, a lot of close finishes down the stretch here. Some games that were a little more spread out than we may have thought going into the week, but nonetheless, we are here to talk about them before you, as mentioned in the previous episode, take off to Houston for a couple of weeks.
Houston, Texas, not Houston, Ohio. Yeah, how about Ohio having Houston and Rushi, which are spelled as Houston in Russia. So, of course, the different part of the state, we're not going to talk about them. I'm not even sure if Houston has football.
Who knows?
Yeah, so, I mean, they're really good in basketball either way. But, yeah, I'm going to take off after this week. I will be watching attentively when we have our live stream on Friday with Waverly at Unioto. That'll be, the last 2 Fridays have been instant classics. So, hopefully that continues for Week 3. It was a...
Tell you what, if I see another game end on a failed 2-point conversion, I'm going to be very upset.
And, I think Waverly's 2-point conversion try was a little more...
warranted.
Well, yeah, I didn't mind Northwest, but I thought the way Northwest attacked theirs was not in what their strength is, where I thought that game, especially for Waverly, I thought was a little bit more of what their strength is. But... I think neither one was like a specialized play either. I think it'd be nice to kind of have that like
Philly special end around lineman catch a 2-point conversion.
Did you throw one in your last game, or did you catch it on the Philly special?
I tried to throw it. I completed it for, I think, maybe -1 yards or something. But
yeah. I remember being there at
McNick.
And seeing it and trying to make the play happen. It's hey, at least you guys tried something. I mean, you got to do some stuff when
100% career completion percentage. So
let's go.
Always makes it a little better. But if you're ready to go, John, we can jump right into the game reviews from Week 2. If you want to start things off with Waverly at Zane Trace.
Yeah, Week 1, Waverly aired it out with Mason Kelly. Finding a bunch of different receivers. Is it Cody Swords? The S words. Had a big night receiving. Mason Kelly threw for 366 yards through the air. But really, the big thing with Waverly is it's always been, not always, but the last couple of years, it's been a lot of Jase Hurd.
Yep.
The senior only had 15 yards on 13 carries against Miami Trace. Well, in Week 2, that was a little different, as Jase Hurd had 296 yards rushing on 31 carries. So Mason Kelly went from throwing for 366 yards, kind of needed to do it in Week 1, to only having to throw 8 times for 65 yards in Week 2. Cody Swords had 2 catches for 65 yards in the game, including a score. But Jase Hurd just ran wild all over Zane Trace. Zane Trace fought the entire game. They scored with, I want to say it was less than 5 seconds left to make it the 48-28 final. Carter Langley had a couple of scores on the ground. Had one in the air to Aiden Dunn early. And then Blake Phillips had a nice game rushing on the ground. He's a really tough runner. For Zane Trace, they're still trying to figure some stuff out.
They had really, really tough non-league.
Yeah, and then it doesn't get easier as they go to North Union this week, who, had a nice season a year ago, is off to a 1-1 start. So that's going to be a really tough start for Zane Trace in the non-league. And kudos to them for stepping up the non-league schedule after, losing I believe they played McClain and Madison Plains a year ago, along with Logan. So those were a little easier wins for them last year, where McClain is better this year also. But, really stepping it up in the non-league and giving themselves a little tougher matchup. But Waverly, I'm sure Coach Crabtree and his staff are really trying to figure out, we got to get Jase Hurd going, and they did it a huge way. I think I mentioned 4 touchdowns as well. So.
Yeah, big game for him, and we'll talk about him a little bit later as well.
Yes.
Then to our next game, it was our live-streamed game of the week. It was McClain at Northwest. Even going into the game, I know, John, you mentioned how you figured it would be pretty low scoring, which it ended up being on only 27 combined points between the two teams. You know, we kind of figured it would pretty even matchup. They both faced SVC schools in week 1, and they both do the same in week 3 as well. 14-13 final. The Tigers advanced to 2-0 on this season. For Andrew Potts, it was a lot of the same. 23 carries, 118 yards, 1 rushing touchdown. Continues to show his versatility through the air. Had 4 catches for 26 yards. And then Caden Pinwell, 6 attempts on the ground, similar to last week, although I can't remember the exact yardage. I think he had 118 yards on 6 attempts. This time, 6 rushes for 28 yards, which still isn't bad.
Yeah.
Also had 2 receptions through the air for 12 yards and a touchdown. So Potts and Pinwell accounting for the 2 touchdowns. For Stapleton, didn't necessarily need to throw as much, as dominant as Potts was, especially in the first half. Did have the passing touchdown to Pinwell towards the end of the second quarter. And then for Northwest, Jake Brown, pretty similar thing to Stapleton, just didn't pass as much. Both quarterbacks were over 100 yards in week 1, and then in week 2 they were both under 50. So it was just, we kind of thought it would be a ground and pound game, and that's exactly what it was. But Jake Brown, 6 carries, 18 yards, and a touchdown. Connor Lentz, added to his resume.
That dude's awesome.
Had a blocked PAT. That was pretty much the only thing I could have thought that he could have added on to his week 1 performance. And then he also almost threw for a touchdown, but Carter Runyon was tackled on, I think, like the 2-yard line, and then Campbell ended up just slamming it in anyway. But Lentz on the ground had 69 yards on 11 carries, and then Colton Campbell, only 9 carries in week 1, had 20 attempts for 75 yards and a touchdown that brought it within 1 at, I think there was a minute 27 in the fourth quarter, and then we were talking about it a little bit before we got into the previews. Northwest goes, I think I said on the broadcast for the win, but with a minute 27, it's more for the lead.
Yeah.
But they go for the lead on the 2-point conversion. They try to run speed option to the left side with Brown and Connor Lentz, and McClain was just all over it. I mean, there was just nowhere to go for them. And really, as soon as they got out of the pocket, as soon as Brown got out of the pocket, it was almost over with.
Up, yeah.
Right. So there just wasn't really anywhere to go. And McClain held on for the 14-13 win. It was really the tale of 2 halves, because in the first half it's McClain 14-0, and then in the second half it's Northwest 13-0. So
and then also McClain had that almost 10-minute long drive in the first half. Northwest answered with like an 8-minute long drive in the second half. So it was really, each team dominated a half. It was just McClain made 1 extra play there at the end. Northwest did drive in the first half, but Caden Pinwell had a huge hit on Brown that forced a fumble. I believe that was the only turnover in the game. I know there's a blocked punt for McClain that set up Northwest in good field position for that last drive. But overall, you mentioned Lentz, 11 carries, 69 yards, 10 carries in the second half. He only had 1 touch in the first half, and it was like, all right, we got to get him involved. Very good coaching on that was to make sure. I mean, I won't say necessarily best player. He was their best player that night, but probably the most dynamic player that can do it in a lot of different ways. And he showed it really well. Him and Pinwell, I thought, both had really good showings for themselves overall as all-around players, offensively and defensively on the night.
When even like for Lentz, he was targeted a couple of times, pretty deep downfield. I know for sure he drew 1 pass interference.
Yes.
Because I know Brown, I think, only attempted 8 passes, so it really weren't a whole lot of options. I know Runyon drew a couple targets as well. So just, it's just one of those ground and pound games where 2 very similar teams matched up, and that's why it was a pretty low scoring game that McClain was able to hold on to, and they'll see if they can continue their winning streak here in 2023 as they take a trip down to Bainbridge to take on Paint Valley this week. And for Northwest, they'll stay at home as they host Huntington, who you'll get
we'll talk about in just a second. Yeah, so Huntington traveled to Beaver to take on the Eastern Eagles. Eastern started off 1-0. They had kind of a weird start last year, but had a big time finish leading to an SOC 1 championship that they split with Northwest. Well, the Eagles got off to a fast start behind senior Jase White, who scored a touchdown through the air and on the ground. He also recovered an onside kick in the game, so kind of an all-around game for White. We saw him on the basketball court. He can do a little bit of everything, just a really good athlete for Coach Tomlinson there with the Eagles. And the Eagles flew to a 31-14 victory over the Huntsmen. Landon Rhinesmith had a big game on the ground for them, as well as also they got a score from Brewer Tomlinson, which I feel like would be terrifying seeing him come downhill at you, as he is not small and he is not weak physically. So he is a big bruiser if they get him in the backfield, and he was able to score in their 31-14 victory. For Huntington, it was not all for naught. It was not for naught.
Not all for nothing.
Yeah, in the game, DJ Crocker had a couple scores, had a 63-yard catch from Noah Potter. Crocker was right around 100 yards total offense. And, Noah Potter continues to kind of evolve. It seemed like they were trying to figure out some different things at the quarterback position last year, and Potter really made it to where he was the guy for them. And they don't do a ton of passing. I know they've done a little bit more passing so far this year than they had in the previous year. But for the Huntsmen, it doesn't really get any easier as they take on the other SOC co-champion last year. And in Northwest in week 3, well, the Eagles will look to soar to outside of Londonderry and in Chillicothe, as I've gotten yelled at before for calling it Londonderry Southeastern, as it is definitely in the Chillicothe limits, as they'll take on Southeastern, who had an emphatic win last week over Madison Plains. The Cutright kid had over 190 yards rushing. Joey Pfeiffer had 3 rushing touchdowns. It's a Southeastern team that's, not very experienced age-wise, but they've got a lot of kids that played a lot of varsity football last year, a lot of sophomores and juniors playing some big downs for them. So they actually had one win last year, and it was over Eastern, a 40-22 win. That honestly, I mentioned upset of the year in soccer of a tie in the last episode, but I feel like that was probably the biggest upset of all of last year was that win, as Eastern ended up having a really good year and Southeastern really struggled after that week. But they seem like they're starting to get on the right track, so that's going to be a tough game for Eastern. I think that'll be a game to watch for sure in week 3.
And then heading down to Portsmouth for our final game review of week 2 was the frequently referred to as the crosstown rivalry between Portsmouth and West. Last year, West was, I think, 34-7 winners in that matchup, and pretty dominant win this year as well for the Senators, 31-14 on the ground. Mason Parker, 140 yards with 3 touchdowns on 15 attempts. Cole Tipton also had a rushing touchdown. Portsmouth West, 7 fumble recoveries on the game.
Must have been some hitting in that game.
It's going to be tough. Well, and we mentioned how really for West, a lot of their defense minus Sissel was coming back. I mean, they had a lot of all SOC 2 selections coming back. So defensively, you really weren't worried too much about their defense. 7 fumble recoveries is going to be hard to win a game when you turn the ball over 7 times. But Chase Highland still 23 attempts for 90 yards and a touchdown. Cam Smith also had a rushing touchdown. But like I said, it's going to be tough to recover when you hand the ball to the other team 7 times. I know I picked Portsmouth to win that game.
I thought they had a good chance. I picked West in our pick'em thing.
Right. But it really, and I think I mentioned it wouldn't surprise me if it went either way. I maybe thought Highland would have a better game, but this Portsmouth West defense, it might be the real deal. And, we'll get a look at them this week against Hillsborough, who has a couple good runners as well. And Portsmouth will take on Greenup County. So
Yeah, never know about the teams are across the river. So, but for Portsmouth, I feel like in week 1, they didn't get hit a lot.
Yeah.
I feel like they were breaking a lot of big runs. So I think where West really probably was, kind of laying the wood to them a little bit, and that may have caused some of those fumbles. Good thing for Portsmouth, they're still really young, so they can
Right.
definitely reconvene as they take on the Green Up Turnips. I don't
know. I didn't look.
I feel like I know what their mascot is, but I don't really, no offense to them, care enough to think about it at this time. I know they have some good athletes over there.
The Musketeers.
The Musketeers, wouldn't have guessed that. It's a, speaking of mascots, that reminds me of Xenia having like the exact same thing as Xavier, but they're the Buccaneers instead of the Musketeers.
What is a Bucketeer?
Buccaneer.
Oh, Buccaneer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I might have said Bucketeers, but Bucket of Tears, which West may have sent Portsmouth a bucket of tears after they beat them. I don't know. They might play for a trophy.
If they don't, they should.
It should be like the secession trophy since they left.
Portsmouth.
They're in West Portsmouth.
It'd be cool if it was like a model of like the bridge in
Yeah.
Portsmouth. I mean, that would be a little bit more related to Portsmouth than to Portsmouth West.
Right.
But I think that'd still be a pretty cool
But
trophy.
really, when you're in West Portsmouth, you can see it. You can see the bridge and stuff. It's just down the road.
Right.
Maybe it should be a model of Walmart since it's in New Boston, and New Boston doesn't have football, either anymore or ever. I don't know which. I'm sure I could find it for Glenwood offhand, but I'm sure that the Glenwood folk probably don't watch the football episodes since they don't
Probably
have it.
not.
No. But yeah, so I know that's a big rivalry game. I could see it being a little tighter next year, but West must have. West was down early, 8-6.
Well, and really, West, when you look at it, pretty. I'd say 9 times out of 10, West probably wins that week 1 matchup against Fairland, which probably would have changed my outlook on the game a little bit, even though it was just one last-second 15-yard run. But yeah, I think West is kind of showing who they are headed into week 3 against Hillsborough. So
yeah. So should be pretty fun.
And then we have 4 impact players on tap for this week. John, if you want to start.
There are some monster games performed this week. And, I'll start with Newton Hoops from Unioto. He actually was knocked out for pretty much a series and a half, almost 2 series. And sophomore David Long took over, led them on. His dad had a really fun post about it, how he had his first career pass attempt and first career turnover in the same drive, but the defense got the ball back after he fumbled. In the second drive, he was able to lead him for a score, but Hoops was able to come back in. He threw for a couple first downs in that first drive before leaving to just get checked on by All-State trainer Philip Hughes on the sideline, actually came back and threw for 343 yards, which is a Unioto school record, breaking the previous record of Ricky Shifko against Zane Trace in 2002. That's a weird way to say it. 2002.
There you go.
Ricky played for Coach Tim Dailey at Unioto at the time. Had to give a shout out to both of them on that. But really, Hoops didn't throw for a ton of yards in the first half. It was almost a stalemate. Amanda punted. It was down to the 2. Hoops ended up connecting with Jake Howard for a short gain. Then his brother Blake Hoops, and it might have been his first catch of the season as he missed week 1 after missing the preseason with an injury. That's a big wide receiver coming back for them. He hit Caden Cutright for a first down, and then on the last play of the first half, 62 yards, he hit Ashton Crace, a fellow senior. It was weird because Amanda wasn't letting anything go over the top, and then they played straight man on the outside, and Crace just flew by his defender. 62-yard touchdown in the half, and then Unioto, they had a little bit of a slow start in the second half as Hoops did throw his first interception of the year. But after they held Amanda to a field goal, he hit Caden Cutright for a 76-yard touchdown pass on a deflected pass, and then hit Cutright for a final score that really put the game away was a 23-yard pass. Slipped. They made an adjustment at the line. Coach Hoops told me that Caden and Hoops made an adjustment at the line, and he was able to slip through the defense for a 23-yard score. But like I mentioned, 343 yards through the air, 20 of 29 passing, 3 touchdowns. And then Ashton Crace had over 100 yards receiving in the game. And then Caden Cartwright had 167 yards and 2 touchdowns of the game as well. So
it's pretty good.
Yeah, big game for the Shermans as they've got a big one coming up, taking on a guy that you're going to talk about right now.
Yeah, Jase Hurd for Waverly after a pretty rough week 1, 13 carries for 15 yards this week. 31 carries for 296 yards after week 1 was on pace for 150 yards on the season. Now is on pace for 1,500 yards on the season. 4 touchdowns as well for Hurd. I mentioned in the review of that game last week how a kid ran for 1,400 yards last year. It wouldn't surprise me if he ran for 200 yards in this game. Well, he almost ran for 300. There was a Logan Elm defense that sort of got gashed a little bit on the ground by Logan Elm.
Zane Trace defense.
The Zane Trace defense who got gashed a little bit on the ground by Logan Elm. So it seemed like a favorable matchup for Hurd, which it clearly ended up being. It took a lot of pressure off of Mason Kelly, who threw for under 100 yards, and the week before threw for 396 or 366. Yeah. So, definitely the tale of 2 games for Waverly, and hopefully coming up here in week 3, they're able to put 2 and 2 together and have a good game on the ground and have a good game through the air as well.
Yeah, I'm sure Coach Hoops is probably not thrilled to see Hurd have that massive game, as you might have been able to say, hey, we're just going to take away the run and focus on the pass. Well, I think Zane Trace thought they were just going to take away the pass, and then Jase Hurd and that offensive line really made plays all night long, as running for 4 touchdowns. Is a huge game in that win for Waverly. Then moving on to our next impact player on the west side with Mason Parker. 15 carries, 140 yards, like you mentioned, 3 touchdowns. Mixed in with Cole Tipton, who also had a score on the ground, and West with a big rivalry win over Portsmouth, 31-14. The West Siders were actually losing 8-6 at the half in that game. And then, Parker and Tipton combined to kind of run wild on the Trojans in the second half. As you mentioned, 7 turnovers forced on the via fumble.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of fumbles caused in that game. And, big win for West, after being shocked at the Rock in week 1. Put it on a T-shirt, like you mentioned.
Yeah, put it on a T-shirt.
Put wins on a T-shirt, maybe not losses. But just kind of moving on with West, they take on a Hillsborough team that I think it's
been maybe a little surprising with how, because they played Western Brown
really
relatively close, and then a big win over Goshen in week 2.
Pounded Goshen, which you're going to talk about here in a second. But yeah, that'll be a big time matchup, especially in the running game in week 3, because
Austin Barrett of the Hillsborough Indians in week 2 against Goshen had 21 carries for 156 yards and 2 touchdowns in the win. Something I wasn't aware of until I was actually doing a little bit of research was last year in week 4 against Williamsburg set the single game rushing record with 370 yards on 22 attempts. Also tied
only 22 attempts and 370 is so nuts. Also
tied the single game rushing touchdowns record with 5. So an all around historical performance last year for Barrett, and about as good of a performance as you can ask for from a tailback in high school with 156 yards and 2 touchdowns this week. They have a tough matchup in West this week that did a pretty good job against Chase Highland in week 2. So, we'll see what happens with Barrett. Hillsborough has a couple other capable runners as well, one that was over 100 yards in that game as well. So, we'll see what happens here in week 3 with those 2 teams.
Well, I think with, in a 56-19 game over Goshen, he probably wasn't getting a lot of carries late either. So I'm guessing he could have just kept gashing them the whole night if, it was a little tighter game. Yeah. But for Hillsborough, I don't want to put a damper on passing yardage records, but if you think of Ohio football, with Woody Hayes, you always hear 3 yards in a cloud of dust because it was so much running heavy for years in Ohio. So you hear of a kid breaking a rushing record for a single game at a school like Hillsborough, who's had football forever. And, that's super impressive. So I'm excited to see what he does in week 3 when he takes on West as, the Winneters. Was that what you called him last year?
Well, did I say that?
I think
That's
you
a
said
good
it last year.
The Winneters.
Yeah.
I like it. The Windians versus the Winneters.
Yes. And in week 3, we'll see who stands tall to move to 2-1 and really solidify themselves in the playoff race moving forward. As, with more teams making the playoff race, it is a little easier, but for like a school like Hillsborough, I think they're still Division 3.
I think they're Division 2.
Well,
or they were.
Well, Division 2 in like football or in basketball and baseball, but I mean for football where it'd be,
we played them in the playoffs.
But that was Division 4.
Oh, I'm football, right?
Yes,
right,
yeah.
Right, yeah.
So I mean, they're either 3 or 4 in their division, which their region, which Unioto would be in if it's Division 4, obviously is very tough as there's a lot of really tough teams from the Cincinnati area in it. So for them, they got to get points when they can. So that's going to be a big time matchup for them because West is going to pick up a lot of points for somebody if they're able to beat West, because West is going to win a lot of games this year. So should be a game to watch. I know we're not previewing that one, but that's going to be
it'd be interesting to see where both teams stand in comparison to each other.
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to preview 4 games, but if we're going to preview 6, that's probably one of them. That's probably one of the first ones out of that.
Right. First 2 out.
Mm-hmm.
But of the games we are going to preview for week 3, John, do you want to kick things off with McClain at Paint Valley?
Yeah, an old school rivalry. These two stopped playing for a number of years. I'm not really 100% sure why, but it's good to see it coming back, where it'll be in the Painted Valley. The Paint Valley, if you haven't been to Paint Valley, like a football game is a completely different atmosphere there.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's very similar, down on the river with, some of the really good historic programs, but Paint Valley makes it it's a night out when you're at that game. It's super fun. And then especially this time of year, maybe a couple of weeks later when the leaves are all starting to change and everything, but Paint Valley is a beautiful atmosphere to watch a sporting event. And if you get a chance, get out and watch them. That should be a really game for sure. Really game to watch, but a really good game to watch between, 2 teams that, with McClain and Paint Valley, pretty similar ways of attacking, McClain with Potts running the ball, kind of their, smash mouth, hard running style, and Braylon Robertson the same for Paint Valley. Now, Paint Valley with Preston Fauber at quarterback will find Carson Free. So maybe a little bit more in the passing game. Free had like just over 1,000 yards receiving last year. I think it was 1,002 or 1,004, but he set the Paint Valley record for receiving touchdowns. And if you saw Paint Valley play you wouldn't have seen it because I'm not sure you're alive at time, but right at the turn of the century when they had Ben Weisenberger, Mark Workman, Matt Workman, I believe it was Travis Tapman, who ended up going to Marshall and playing. They just had a bunch of dudes that could really throw the football. So for Carson Free to break a school record for receiving touchdowns in the season is huge for them. And, he's a good athlete. I've heard he got into the weight room pretty hard this year, so he's bigger, faster, stronger. So with Fauber to Free, and then with Robertson running the ball, that's going to be a dangerous offense. I know they lost Dom Chambers for the year, and that's obviously a big impact on their running game. But they went and played a very good West Jefferson team. It wasn't a very good showing in week 2, but they're better than that. West Jefferson would be one of the top probably 3 or 4 teams in our area if we covered, if we went up and covered them. So, I mean, them losing big in that game is not something to really dampen my thoughts on what this Paint Valley team can be. And then really McClain last week showed that when they, things maybe weren't going exactly how they were wanting to in that second half.
Yeah.
But when they had to make a play with a minute 27 left against Northwest, they stepped up and made a big play defensively to hold on for that 14-13 win. But when you got a guy like Andrew Potts, Caden Penwell can, be a change of pace guy. They've got some different guys that can make plays for him. And I think this could be a really good matchup at Paint Valley. I know we've been doing some predictions on these game previews. I'm going to take the Bearcats.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think it'll be something like 28-21. I think McClain will be able to put up a little bit of points. I don't know if they'll be able to put up the points they put up in week 1. But I think with Paint Valley, I think Robertson, I think Faber will hit free for a couple of big plays, and it'll be a one that I'm definitely gonna keep my eye on, because I think that's gonna be an interesting matchup, because I think this McClain team is better than they have been in the past. I think Coach Penwell does a good job with them there. They've got some big time weapons as well. So
another game we're looking at in week 3 is Logan Elm at Miami Trace. Both of those teams have been pretty dominant so far here in 2023. Logan Elm remains undefeated, 2-0 after beating Zane Trace and Westfall in weeks 1 and 2, two SVC schools. Miami Trace drops to Wilmington.
Cane Pride.
In week 2 after taking down Waverly in week 1. So definitely a good week 1 win. We don't know a whole lot about Wilmington, but I would say they're probably pretty respectable this year.
This is kind of my experience with teaching there and, coaching baseball. It's a very similar school district to Chillicothe. It's the biggest in the area because it's a city school. That doesn't always mean biggest is better, but they have a wide variety of athletes to choose from. So it's a good sized school, and they're pretty proud, obviously Cane Pride, pretty proud football program. So, I thought Miami Trace would win that game, but at the same time, it doesn't surprise me too much because, Wilmington maybe not every year is at the top of their league, but they're usually a pretty competitive program over there.
But for Logan Elm, you have Aaron Walters, who had a really good week 1 against Zane Trace, and had a good week 2 against Westfall as well. Out wide, you have Cam Smith, Carson Summers, and Camden Red. Landon Thompson, a really good back to have for Logan Elm as well. And then for Miami Trace, we've seen Trey Robinette, Asher LeBeau, Garrett Guess, Gage Stuckey, a couple other guys out wide, Connor Napier. I can't remember the kid's first name, but Evan Colgrove.
Yes, Evan Colgrove. He
doesn't get a ton of touches, but gets 3, 4, 5 to shake up the pace from a guy like Asher LeBeau. It's at Miami Trace. Logan Elm still unbeaten. I think I might roll with the Panthers on this one. I don't know what I think, to be honest.
Well,
it's I don't know if they're like similar in their play styles, but I think their level of competitiveness is pretty similar. And I think it'll definitely be a 1-score game, probably less than 7. But
I think, I picked Zane Trace to beat Logan Elm. They did not. And Logan Elm kind of put it on him. Zane Trace, it ended up being a 2-score game, but it was really a 3-score game with them in Waverly. And Waverly was really tight with Miami Trace. So, doing this happens. But Miami Trace and Waverly were comparable. I feel like Waverly and Logan Elm are probably comparable in that way. So I think I'm going to take Miami Trace at home as well. But, Logan Elm, it's a program with a lot of kids that can really play, like you mentioned. Receivers that can go get the ball with Red and Smith and Summers. Walters. It's a good quarterback matchup. I think the lines may ultimately decide this game. Good running back matchup too. Yeah. I mean, I could see this one being one of those weird, either really high scoring or really low scoring games, just because the teams I feel like are very similar. And I think it's going to be a good matchup. I think with, Miami Trace, I think has played a better schedule so far. It's not the Westfall team of old. As a guy who coached at Westfall for baseball for a long time, it hurts to see, but I do think Westfall's a little bit better, but I think Wilmington is a better week 2 team than Westfall. So, that's going to be a heck of a game.
That's a tough one to pick.
Yeah.
Like, I want to go with Miami Trace, and I've seen Miami Trace in person, which probably adds a little bit of bias. I'd say if I had seen Logan Elm, I might think a little bit differently of them because I've only seen box scores. I haven't actually seen them play. But yeah, I'll go with Miami Trace just because they're the home team, and coming in 1-1, they're, I guess you could count them as an underdog because they're not undefeated, and Logan Elm is. So we'll see. I'm sure we'll have a writer at the game. I would at least think we would.
I would hope so for that one especially.
But we'll see.
But yeah, I watched them both scrimmage Unioto. Logan Elm I thought was really impressive in that matchup. But at the same time, I've been really impressed with Miami Trace so far. In the early going, I'm going to look up real quick on Fantastic 50 and see if they've got a
spread.
Yeah, a spread on this
if
game.
They do have a spread, it can't be more than 5 points. I would be surprised if it was.
You said not more than 5 points. Right now on Fantastic 50, it has Logan Elm as a 1 point favorite.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be a really tight game.
Right.
And, they're two teams, I feel like very similar styles. So I think it's going to be a really tight matchup. I would hope we have a writer there because I feel like it's going to be a really good game.
It should be. On paper, it definitely should be.
Yeah, for sure. And then speaking of another game that should be really good, Jackson hosting Wheelersburg. Wheelersburg, played Ironton tighter at the Tank. They both played games at, at Ironton. Different scoring. Fantastic 50 in this one has Wheelersburg as a 6 point favorite over Jackson, even at Jackson.
That might be a little high.
Yeah, I think that's a little high. I think this is going to be really probably a 3 point game. Excuse me on that. If you can hear it, I don't know. Hold on. We got to cut that.
Oh, that was bad.
Yeah. Okay.
With...
So whenever you say a little high, because that was kind of, Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably a little high. I think it's probably going to be, I would say probably a 3 point game, maybe closer. Both teams will have good kicking games. Like we've mentioned before, I think that's one of the staples you'll see with the better teams is you're going to have a good kicking game. Especially schools that have soccer, you should be able to find a kicker out of your soccer team if your soccer team's
respectable.
Yes. But I'll throw this out there, even sometimes not, because a few years ago, once again, showing my age, I don't think it was actually a few years ago. It's probably like 10 to 15 years ago. Washington
Courthouse.
Yeah, had a little struggle with their boys soccer team and had a girl kicker. She was really good, and their girls soccer team was not good, but she was a really good kicker. I can't remember her name offhand, but sometimes even with not a very good team, you can pull a kicker. Going to Wilmington, Cane Pride, they had a couple kickers. One kid was not a very good kicker. This is one of my favorite stories. And he would always talk to me in class like, "Oh, I'm going to be a Division I kicker." And I would follow his stats. He just wasn't very good. He walked on at Cincinnati and didn't really get a chance, because he had a big leg. Now he made a 56-yard field goal last year for Temple.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I mean, it's like if you're going to do it, go all out in it. And he's been able to get a scholarship out of it. So one of those things you just never know because you put in the hard work. But going on to that matchup, Braylon Rucker in week 1 had a little bit of struggle. I think he threw three interceptions against that Ironton defense. But in week 2, playing a really good Archbishop Nick Nicholas team from Cincinnati, threw for 232 yards and a score. I don't know what I was saying, but 232 yards and a score. He did throw an interception in that game, but only a sophomore quarterback who will be making his third start. So I I'm just looking at like his first start at Ironton.
That's rough.
Yeah. Second start, you play McNicholas, who's always good. You know that from experience. And then in week 3, you go to Jackson. At least you got week 2 at home.
Right.
But
and who do they have? Do you know who they have week 4 for Wheelersburg?
Let me look real quick.
Starting off with those
It's Northwest.
Okay.
At least it's at home. But Northwest, Connor Lentz is a player.
Right. And he's playing safety on defense as well.
Yeah. So it's a really tough go so far for him. But the good thing is Landon Hutchinson and Creed Warren, who both had big games in week 2. Warren amassed 173 yards total offense and a score, while Landon Hutchinson had 44 yards on the ground and a score. He scored in both games so far for them. For Jackson, not like they've had an easy start to the season. They won a rivalry game 22-0 against Logan, who, is a team that they always play tight. Then they go to Ironton on a Saturday night, late start.
Right.
Like I remember, in our SOSA group chat, it was like, do we have someone at the game? Just because Brock hadn't put up an update yet, because the game didn't start until after 8:30. It was such a late start because they had 2 full games before it. They wanted to make sure everyone got their full warm up in. Against Ironton, Cade Wolford had a monster game, had 143 yards on the ground and a score. We've talked about before, he is one of the most dynamic players in our coverage area and all of Southeast Ohio, and that's why he's got a number of offers. I love when I see like a different offer and it's like Yale, Harvard, and so he's real smart too at the same time, because I feel like you don't just get an offer from Harvard or Yale without being able to get into school there.
Right.
And that's why you'll see every once in a while like Harvard or Yale, not really Yale, but Harvard or Cornell will have a really good basketball team. It's like it just has to work out to where they have those really good really good players that can also really play, and Wolford's one of them. I think it's going to be a really tight game. I love Holzer Stadium. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful stadium. I will guarantee we will have a writer at that one.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, because that's going to be a massive game. Probably, outside of, we've covered some really big games coming up. We got another one that you're going to talk about here in a second, but I'm going to take Wheelersburg. I'm going to say by 3. I'm going to say Connor Eastep field goal in the waning seconds. Yeah,
game-winning field goal. See, I don't know. Did you look at the spread for that one?
That was the 6-pointer.
Oh yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, and that one had Jackson or Ironton Wheelersburg as a 6-point favorite. Yeah. So I'll take Jackson to cover, but I do think I think it'll be about a 3-point game. So, but I will take. I'm going to take Wheelersburg to win.
Like I hate picking the same as you because that kind of takes the fun out of it. But I'm not going to penalize myself because you went before me. Right. So I would agree with that. I think Wheelersburg would take that one. Just simply, I think if you look at the Ironton game, and they both played at Ironton, and I think, and I think Bodie Wolford has been taking snaps at quarterback for Jackson. So they're both with first-year quarterbacks, both sophomores. So I don't know.
I feel like Sean Terry was able to get going a lot more against Ironton or against Jackson. The Iron Men. Yeah. So I think Wheelersburg maybe will have a package to try to get Lattimore going a little bit more. Rucker seemed like he was a little more comfortable. Maybe it was because it was at home, but it's going to be a tough game for them on the road, and that place is going to be packed, loud, and it's going to be a really fun atmosphere there on Friday night.
And our last game to preview for week 3 is our live stream game of the week. The Waverly Tigers taking the tramp, I believe we phrased it, down to Frenchtown to take on the Unioto Shermans, who, similar to the Miami Trace Logan Elm matchup, Waverly coming in 1-1, Unioto still 2-0 after a tight win against Vinton County and a pretty decisive win that was more or less because of its decisive second half against Amanda Clear Creek. Waverly coming off of a big win against an SVC foe in Zane Trace. And I think if Hurd didn't have as good of a week 2,
Right.
you might feel a little bit different about this game coming out of week 1. But Jase Hurd goes off for 296 yards, goes from averaging 15 yards a game to now he's averaging 150 yards a game. It takes a lot of pressure off of Mason Kelly, only his second year under center. You still have dudes out wide with like Sparks, Pollard, Swords, and even Hurd out of the backfield. It's a pretty dynamic offense. And then Lane Bear also had the what would have been kind of the game time catch at the end. So it's a pretty dynamic offense for Waverly. I think you could kind of make the comparison a little bit between Unioto and Miami Trace. I think Unioto is definitely a lot more pass heavy. But I think in terms of offense, they're pretty similar. For Unioto, obviously, you're going to get a lot of Newton hoops. We've already talked about Crace and cut right out wide. Doesn't really seem like, at least through the first 2 weeks, they've established a run game, I would say.
So when I mentioned they hadn't really got a lot of passing going in that first half against Amanda, it's because they were trying to establish the run and just weren't really having much success. They had much better success in the second half once they opened things up in the passing game.
But I think when you look at a guy like Asher LeBeau, had a pretty good game against Waverly. So if Unioto is able to establish a run game with whoever that may be,
it was more Condor Dollison in week 2. James Reinhart did some running as well. I think they both ended up with 34 yards in the game on like 7 or 8 carries. So not like a bad yards per carry, but Dollison was a little more consistent on the getting 4 to 5 yards a carry for them.
So we'll see what happens. Obviously, you won't be there, but myself and my dad will be there. I think Kenny's coming along with us as well for that game. And Stranger Things, Kenny. Yes. But, it should be a good game. If you want to pull up the spread for that one,
they have Waverly as a 7-point favorite.
7? Wow.
Now, I believe last year that was one of the biggest upsets on... Or maybe it was like the best performances because Unioto was a big underdog last year at Waverly and ended up winning that game pretty easily. But they got
2 big scores at the end.
Yeah,
they got a little bit.
They got an interception that set up a 1-play drive, and then they stopped. Then they stopped Waverly on a 4th down and had a 1-play run drive. Yeah, so it was really a 7-point game throughout. It ended up being a 3-score game at the end, but. This is a game we do pretty much every year. On the live stream should be another really good game. Should be a really good crowd. I know Waverly travels really well. Yep. Unioto had some big crowds late in the year last year. They're more of a baseball school, but when they're good at football, they pack in the bleachers there at Unioto, and they've got a new track which will be on display that night. Should be it's a little different. So that's kind of cool part. But I think for Unioto, when you mentioned Cutright and Crace, Cody Braden's another one. He's had a big time deep ball in week 1, but he's done a really good job at the safety position. Him and Ty Woods, both only sophomores, having to adjust at the safety position. How are they gonna? It's going to be vital for those two to not get sucked up too much into the run stop and not be able to get beat deep by Mason Kelly. So I kind of mentioned, when we talked about Hurd earlier, was, for Coach Hoops and his staff was probably like, okay, we can
handle this.
Yeah. And then you get the film for week 2 and it's like, oh, this is exactly what we expected them to be. And, so,
well, I think that's kind of the issue with, scheming a defense against Waverly, because it's sort of just pick your poison. I mean, which do you feel more comfortable kind of going against? Do you want to stop the run and kind of let him go to the pass a little bit, or do you want to see if Hurd can, do what he did in week 2, or do you want to test your luck and see if you can hold him to what he did in week 1? For Unioto, just through 2 weeks, I think is a little bit easier to scheme against. I think you say, all right, let's see if they can establish the run now. If Unioto is able to do that, then you have problems. But
now, one thing that Amanda did, they really played just a high cover 2 throughout the first half, but then they still were doing it in the third, and that's when started hitting the underneath passing game a little bit more. Cutright was able to break a couple of big plays even on those. But with like a Jake Howard, a senior wide receiver, see if they can get him involved a little bit more. This is a game where Blake Hoops being back is going to be huge because he's more the underneath guy. He gets kind of the little more slot receiver yardage where, Cutright and Crace can really get you over the top. Braden can get you over the top. I'm sure if Blake heard me say that he's not an over the top guy, he'd be like, I can go over the top because he can fly too. So, I mean, they've got a lot of guys. So if you get sucked up too much into, if they get the passing game going underneath, that's when those guys over the top can really get you going for the Sherman says they've scored 4 passing touchdowns over 58 yards so far. With Braden has one for 70, Cartwright has one for 58 and 76, and then Crace had the 62-yarder. So can they establish a shorter passing game and kind of get some chunk yardage that way to go along with the running game? Dollison runs really hard. Will they try to get David Long involved with the running game too, right, as well, because he's a really good athlete. I think for the Shermans up front defensively, with like Marcel James, Ben Griffin can do it, Will Fleck, some guys on the defensive line have to be able to make some plays and be able to stop the run, contain the run. KB Perkins is really big on that. Perkins and Fleck do a really good job of shutting down kind of the like the bubble screens a little bit because they're so big and long. So that's going to be a tough thing for other teams to do against them. But, for Unioto, I think you still got to focus on Jase Hurd. I think you just got to do what you can to take him away and then adjust to the passing game from there. And I think that's where those DBs on the outside, it's going to be a huge game for them.
Yeah, and for this game, I'm not going to make a pick.
I mean, we have a Unioto helmet here.
Right.
And you're calling the game.
And I didn't go to Waverly, but
you live in Waverly.
Yeah, right.
So there's at least part of the time.
Right. So there's a little bit of bias there either way. So I'm just
and we know, Coach Nobby,
right.
Matt Snodgrass was here earlier. This
is like one side of the family versus the other.
Yeah.
Side of the family,
so it's a game. I'm not going to be there.
Right.
And it's a game where watching it from afar is going to be, a little easier. I know a lot of Waverly people, not as closely as you do, but right, this is a kind of like a Unioto of Vinton County. And I really want to say Waverly and Zane Trace should probably be like this. These are communities that are close and they need to play every year. And I think this is going to be, there might be some chippiness just because of that. But they're two proud athletic programs. You got Tigertown, you got the Shermans,
Frenchtown.
You got Frenchtown.
Although
Yeah.
I've never
Not really
that.
the same.
No.
The game will be played inside a township. As if you ever drive by the school at Unioto, there's a sign that says entering Union Township, which is exactly where the high school gym ends. So the basketball games are played inside a township, but when you enter the school, you're entering in Union Township,
right,
which is Union Scioto. But yeah, should be an interesting game. I think, the Unioto shocked Waverly. What year was that?
2019.
Yeah, 2019 was a really big upset at the time. Then last year Unioto won, but for the most part, since the team started playing again, it's been mostly Waverly.
That was going to be the one last thing I say about the game was for a majority of the time they've been playing, it's been a lot of Waverly. Mm-hmm. Unioto's won 2 of the last 3.
Yeah.
And you look back at the last 4 matchups, it's been every other time.
Yeah.
So, we'll see what happens. If that trend continues, then, it's been the away team every time.
Yes, the away team's won it.
So we'll see if Waverly can continue that or if Unioto can start off I think it'd be their first winning streak against Waverly, and
right,
as long as I can remember. So,
yeah, I don't have it offhand on what the overall series record. I feel like Waverly is. I think it's
definitely.
I think it's 8-4 overall because I think Unioto won a couple games, and probably when they were both in the SCOL and for like 2 years, and like I think it was 75, 76. Just the really strange time. So like whenever we talk about the SVC and people will mention there hasn't been a change since 1980. Okay, my sister was a freshman in 86. So since 1986 when Bishop Leger closed. But the last new member before Bishop Leger was Unioto, even though they were an original member. Like I believe Waverly was an original member of the SOC, but also was an original member that, or was in the
was like the last one that joined.
Yeah. And like they were one of the last ones to join. So it's where they've looked at different places. And I know people say because they're the two biggest schools in their conference, you know, maybe they're need to look elsewhere. But, you know, sometimes when you've tried it before, you're a little hesitant to do it again. But I do think these two schools are pretty closely tied together. You know, so it should be a really good crowd, should be a good stream.
Hopefully.
Yeah, you guys have a good time. Won't be as hot.
No.
Yeah, so should be a fun one. We're going to try something new here, though.
Yeah. I'll let you take lead on this.
Yeah, so I was going to kind of jokingly say we're not going to do power rankings like last week, but then I saw a couple different things. I was like, you know, maybe we'll try our hand at it.
I don't think, man, I don't know. I don't think it could get any.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to try some different things every week.
Try to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah.
This has been a very eventful day. So
yeah, I'm not gonna say it because I don't want to jinx myself for this last few minutes, but I'm gonna make a graphic. So if the graphic's poorly, when it gets put on the bottom of the screen here, that's on this guy. If it's awesome, it's Dewey, even though it's gonna be me. So it's gonna be. This could be an
we'll
adventure.
See.
Yeah,
we'll see.
But we're gonna try something new, and if it sticks, great. If it doesn't stick, it was my idea. So if it does stick, it was my idea also. So it's going to be our power rankings. We're going to rank the top 10 teams to us in our coverage area, the SOSA coverage area. So where if we would talk MSL, we would mention Bloom Carroll, but we don't actually cover Bloom Carroll.
Or Taze Valley.
Or Taze Valley, yeah.
There's some
Now Logan and Athens would be eligible because we do cover them. Vinton County's eligible because we cover them.
I think Athens would be as well.
Athens would be, yeah.
But like Alexander, probably not.
Which we strangely don't cover, even though we drive through Albany on the way to Athens. But we don't really cover them. Now Manchester's eligible. If you've seen their first 2 week scores, they will not be in our power rankings. But
Notre Dame made sure of that.
Yes, so you know, keep that in mind. So it's really the teams. So what do we got? We got Fairfield Union, Circleville, Logan Elm.
That's more or less it for the
Yeah,
TVC.
I think Amanda maybe.
Or for the MSL, sorry.
Yeah, MSL. But then for the TVC, it would just be Athens,
Vinton County.
Maybe Alexander.
Right.
Yeah, so and then you look at the OVC.
I'd say Nelsonville, York probably get in there too.
Yeah, we've covered them for girls sports before, so I think it's es posible, as you learned in class today.
I did not.
Have you learned that before?
No.
I think it's just as possible. If it's not as possible, I don't know Spanish, so I'm going to a Spanish-speaking area.
Houston?
No, Galveston's got a lot of Spanish-speaking people in it. And then. So we got the SOCs, we've got the SVC, the FAC,
the one shack.
Yeah, the one shack, and then as we mentioned, the OVC as well. So we got a lot of schools to pick from. We're going to go with our top 10. If it goes well, we'll do it again. If you guys hate it, it's Dewey's fault. If you love it, it's also Dewey's fault. We're just going to blame Dewey for anything. Besides, like, if you notice how chopped up some of these episodes are, that's all my fault. So you're welcome, everybody. So do you want to go first in your power rankings?
Yeah, I guess I can go first.
So we're going to each just go with our list, and then you'll see it on the screen. We'll probably put a graphic out for overtime later as well. Or maybe we just tease it there, but we'll see.
We'll see. So in the one slot, I think this is going to be pretty consistent all year. It's going to be Ironton. 2-0 wins over Wheelersburg and Jackson. Those are pretty much two of the top, I would say, 3 or 4 or 5 teams in our area every year. So I don't really see that changing too much.
Even if they would drop one with just
like this week, there's 1 week, I think it's week 4 maybe, they play on a Saturday, and they play at Marshall against a team across the river. It's Cadell or Cabell something.
I think it's Cable Midland.
Cable Midland.
Yeah.
So, like, if they lose a game like that, it's like,
I'm gonna just roll through these favorites real quick. Week 3, favorite by 32. Week 4, favorite by 25. Week 5, 49. Week 6, 47. Week 7, 47. Week 8, 31.
Is that Portsmouth?
It was Colgrove. Week 9, Guy Academy, favorite by 31. And then week 10, Portsmouth, favorite by 37. So I do think this week with Fairland's going to be tougher. So, but this is still they're favored by 32 on Fantastic 50 because just how good of a program it is. So sorry for interrupting you, dog.
Then at my 2 and 3 slot, we have Wheelersburg and Jackson. Obviously, those two teams playing this week, so those could either flip or, depending on the outcome, it could send one a little lower. Obviously, my rankings don't really have much meaning other than to myself. But
yes.
Then in the 4 slot, we have Logan Elm. They've looked really impressive through the first 2 weeks. Big win over Zane Trace in week 1. Pretty convincing win in week 2 against Westfall. In the 5 slot, we have Fairland. Same thing for them. 2 convincing wins. Come from behind win week 1 against a West team who's also towards the bottom of my top 10. I expect them to probably move up a little bit as the year goes on. Off the top of my head, I can't even remember who Fairland played in week 2. I know they won, but
they beat Wellston 56-21.
Right, so 2 big wins for the Dragons. In the 6th slot,
this is the only game that Fairland is not favored the rest of the game coming up with Ironton as well. Yeah.
On the 6th slot, I have Unioto, still 2-0. Wins a tight one in week 1 over Benton County, and then comes back and has a pretty convincing second half against Amanda. On the 7th slot, well, actually, I'll go 7-8. We have Miami Trace and Waverly, both 1-1. I just kind of went with the head-to-head there. And I did want to mention Unioto was actually, that's not true because Notre Dame is still undefeated.
Yeah.
So 7-8, Miami Trace and Waverly. In the 9th slot, I have West. Now, they'll play teams like Waverly and Wheelersburg, so, we'll see how that goes. 1-1, obviously, if they would have taken down Fairland, probably would be around that spot, probably be 4 or 5. But that loss has them down at 9. And then in the 10th slot, showing a little SOC 1 love with Notre Dame, who's 2-0 through the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, I didn't pick Notre Dame to win it, so I don't have them in my top 10 yet. They have a chance to continue to make some noise as the season progresses. So in my number 1 spot, I do have Ironton, Fighting Tigers. They're, unless something crazy happens, I don't see them really getting shaken out of that spot for the majority of the season. So, I think we might be able to just pencil that in. We'll pencil it in, not put it in pen after this week. Maybe.
Or a erasable pen.
Yeah, maybe put it in pen after this week. But we'll see. My number 2 spot, I have the Berg. I have Wheelersburg. Number 3, I have Logan Elm. I know you had them 4. But I have Jackson at number 4. I think just a little bit because of just the size of the difference between them and Ironton. I know it was a 1-score game going into the 4th, but Ironton able to run away with it a little bit there. In my number 5 spot, someone you don't have ranked, the Blue Devils of Guy Academy. I like what they have coming back. Have not given up a point yet through 2 weeks. It'll be interesting when they take on, I believe it is week 6 with Fairland.
Yeah, that should definitely be a good matchup.
Yeah, but for the most part, they've got a tough one this week at Point Pleasant, which is right across the river. Do you know their mascot?
Point Pleasant?
Yeah.
Is it the Pointers? Well, that's
South Point. No, it's a big and a color. Maybe a color that most people wouldn't use as their mascot at this point. Big Blacks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which there's a show when I was coming through. I'm not gonna say a few years ago, but it was Rob Dyrdek that's Ridiculousness on MTV.
Oh, okay.
It was Rob and Big, and it was his bodyguard friend named Big Black, and that's I feel like, it was one of the funniest shows. But I remember we played a junior high soccer game down at Point Pleasant. They should just be the Mothmen, because they've got the Mothman Bridge.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, I feel like that'd be a more
appropriate.
So, but that's going to be a tough matchup for Gallia. But if Gallia wins that, they're going to be favored in all but 2 games coming up, which would be
Ironton and Fairland.
Yeah, at Fairland, and then Ironton at home. But then I do have Fairland 6th. So I have Fairland right there with them. I have West 7th. Which obviously would probably be switched one spot if, based on that win. I have Unioto 8th, Miami Trace 9th, and Waverly at 10. So the 2 head-to-head games on that did have a one spot.
All right.
Break in my rankings. I do think that this is something that's fluid. We'll see throughout the year. We'll see how our rankings differ.
For the record, Gallia was my first one out.
Yeah.
So I don't want it to appear like I just didn't even think about them.
Yeah.
I did a top 20 because I was bored, but we're only going to do top 10.
Yeah.
So.
Notre Dame would be close for me. And then, we'll see what the SOC love if it continues after this week.
All right. Well, John, I believe that is all we have for this week here on Overtime. Big thank you to McDonald's for sponsoring Overtime and making all of these episodes, no matter how choppy and bad they are, possible.
Yeah.
We got if you watch the Tuesday episode, we've got I can't remember what it's called. It was like Monster Drink Club or something. I can't remember.
So there was a show called Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and one of the superheroes, they only did one episode where they actually fought crime, but one was named Master Shake, and it looks just like him to me. So that made me laugh really hard when we were donated that to the podcast. So,
but once again, thank you to McDonald's for sponsoring this show. We'll be back next Thursday with the football episode, next Tuesday with the volleyball and soccer updates. But for this week, here in week 3, that is all myself and John have for you this week on Overtime, presented by McDonald's.
Spartana Lewski.